Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. A world painted in the quiet hues of agrarian life. The rhythm of existence is set by the sun's gentle arc across the sky and the slow, patient turn of the seasons. The dominant sounds are not of machines, but of the wind rustling through crops, the distant lowing of cattle, and the rhythmic, hands-on work of the artisan's workshop. In this world, time is a vast and spacious concept. A journey of 50 miles is a significant undertaking. Communication is bound by the speed of a galloping horse, and most people live and die within a few miles of their birthplace, their lives intimately tied to the land and the small community they are part of. This was the reality for the vast majority of humans for millennia, a world built on muscle, sweat, and the unwavering cycles of nature. Now, open your eyes to the stark contrast. Imagine the same landscape, but just a few generations later. The sky is no longer just a canopy of blue, but is now streaked with plumes of black smoke, rising from the towering brick stacks of factories. The air, once carrying the scent of earth and rain, now hums with the clatter of machinery and carries the acrid smell of coal and industry. The quiet countryside has been eclipsed by the sprawling, teeming city, a labyrinth of cobblestone and brick where life moves at a frantic, unrelenting pace. The clock, not the sun, now dictates the rhythm of the day, its whistle summoning thousands to their posts in vast, noisy factories. Distance is collapsing under the iron wheels of locomotives, and information is beginning to crackle along telegraph wires. This is the birth of the modern world, a world of immense power, unprecedented production, and profound dislocation. This seismic shift, this fundamental reordering of human society, economy, and consciousness, did not happen over centuries as it had before. It occurred in a historical blink of an eye. This is the story of the Industrial Revolution, the single most transformative event in human history since the development of agriculture. It is the story of the revolution that built our modern world of comfort and convenience, but it is also the story of the immense social and environmental costs that came with it. It is a tale of steam, steel, and ambition, and its profound, complex, and lasting consequences are the very foundations upon which we live today. The term Industrial Revolution itself evokes a sense of sudden, explosive change, a political uprising, but of technology and economics rather than of people. In essence, it was precisely that, a profound and irreversible metamorphosis of human society that began in the late 18th century and accelerated throughout the 19th. It was a departure so dramatic that it represents the great dividing line between the ancient, agrarian world and the modern, industrial one. Prior to this period, the pace of progress, while present, was often glacial. After it, change became a constant, accelerating force. This revolution was not a single event, but a complex and interwoven series of breakthroughs in technology, energy, and social organization that collectively dismantled one world and built another in its place. At its core, the Industrial Revolution was a shift from an economy based on manual labor and draft animals to one dominated by machinery and mechanized manufacturing. It meant moving production from the home and the small workshop, the cottage industry, to the centralized, hierarchical factory. This transition was fundamentally powered by a new relationship with energy. For millennia, humanity had relied on what historians call organic energy sources: human muscle, animal power, wind for sails and mills, and water for wheels. These were limited and often intermittent. The breakthrough was learning to harness inorganic, fossil fuel energy, primarily coal, through the invention and perfection of the steam engine. This provided a reliable, powerful, and location-independent source of power that could run looms, forge iron, and eventually, propel vehicles. Crucially, this revolution first took root in Great Britain in the mid-1700s, creating a blueprint that would soon spread to continental Europe, North America, and eventually the entire globe. It was a perfect storm of enabling factors. Britain possessed abundant natural resources like coal and iron ore. It had a stable political system and a capital-rich economy from its global trade and empire, and it fostered a culture of scientific inquiry and innovation. The revolution unfolded in overlapping waves, often described as the first and second industrial revolutions, introducing not just steam, but later, steel, electricity, the internal combustion engine, and the chemical industry. Ultimately, the Industrial Revolution was more than just a chapter in a history book. It was the genesis of our contemporary world, creating the very framework of our modern existence, for better and for worse, and setting the stage for every technological and societal shift that has followed. To truly grasp the seismic shock of the Industrial Revolution, we must first immerse ourselves in the world it irrevocably displaced. For centuries, the rhythm of life in places like 18th century Britain was dictated not by the clock, but by the sun and the seasons. This was a predominantly rural and agrarian existence. Over 80% of the population lived in the countryside, their lives intimately bound to the land. The social structure was hierarchical yet local, anchored by the landowning aristocracy and worked by a vast peasantry who cultivated the soil. The pace was slow, the horizons were often limited to the boundaries of one's own village, and the economy was primarily subsistence-based. Most people produced what they consumed, with any small surplus being sold at a local market. This was a world built on the muscle of humans and animals, where energy was derived from wood, wind, and water, placing firm limits on productivity and growth. For those not working the land, manufacturing took place within the cottage industry, or putting out system. This was a decentralized world of production. A merchant would provide raw materials, like wool or cotton, to families working from their own homes or small workshops. Using simple tools, a spinning wheel, a hand loom, the family would process these materials into finished yarn or cloth at their own pace. The work was interwoven with the daily routines of farm chores and household duties. There was no separation between work and home life. The home was the workshop. While this system offered a degree of autonomy and flexibility, it was notoriously slow, inefficient, and inconsistent in quality. Production was limited by human speed and endurance, and the entire supply chain was fragmented across countless scattered cottages. This pre-industrial world was also one of profound physical constraint. Travel was slow, arduous, and expensive, undertaken on foot, by horse, or by sailing ship. Communication moved at the same pace, meaning news from a city 100 miles away could be days or even weeks old. Society was largely immobile, both geographically and socially. Most individuals were born, lived, and died within the same small community, their identities and opportunities rigidly defined by the class they were born into. It was a world of localism, tradition, and manual skill. While it possessed a certain pastoral simplicity, it was also a world vulnerable to famine, disease, and the raw power of nature. It was this stable, slow-moving, and deeply rooted society that was about to be torn from its foundations and thrust into the frantic, urban, and mechanized age of industry. The Industrial Revolution was a global phenomenon in its impact, but it was a distinctly British phenomenon in its origins. It did not spontaneously ignite across the world, rather, it emerged from a unique and powerful convergence of factors that made late 18th century Britain the ideal incubator for this transformative change. This was not a matter of chance, but rather a perfect storm of geographical, economic, political, and social conditions that collectively lowered the barriers to innovation and industrialization, creating an environment ripe for explosive growth. First and foremost were the geographical gifts. Britain sat atop vast and easily accessible reserves of the two most crucial raw materials of the early industrial age, coal and iron ore. Coal was the lifeblood, the concentrated fossil fuel that would feed the steam engines and blast furnaces. Iron ore was the skeleton, the raw material for building the machines, railways, and bridges of the new era. These resources were often located near each other, further reducing transportation costs. Furthermore, Britain's island geography, crisscrossed by navigable rivers and later by canals, provided a natural and cost-effective transportation network for moving these heavy goods, a significant advantage over landlocked nations. Beyond mere resources, Britain possessed the necessary economic and capital infrastructure. The agricultural revolution had preceded the industrial one, increasing food supplies and freeing up a large portion of the rural population to become a potential workforce for urban factories. Profits from its vast colonial empire and from the transatlantic trade, including the tragic slave trade, had created a massive accumulation of capital. This wealth was concentrated in the hands of a class of merchants and early industrialists who were willing and able to invest in risky but potentially lucrative new ventures, such as factories and machinery. A developed banking system and financial markets facilitated the flow of this capital to where it was needed. Politically and socially, Britain was uniquely positioned. Following the Glorious Revolution of 1688, it enjoyed a stable constitutional monarchy with a government that generally protected private property rights and enforced contracts, giving investors confidence. Crucially, unlike many of its European counterparts, Britain fostered a culture that celebrated practical science, experimentation, and entrepreneurialism. The Enlightenment spirit of inquiry merged with a strong patent system that rewarded inventors, encouraging figures like James Watt and Richard Arkwright to develop and commercialize their world-changing ideas. In essence, Britain in the 1700s had the right ingredients: the fuel beneath its soil, the money in its banks, the workers in its fields, and the innovative spirit in its culture, all coming together to light the fuse of industry. If the Industrial Revolution had a birthplace, it was not in a grand parliament or a royal court, but within the humble and essential world of cloth production. The textile industry, specifically the spinning of yarn and the weaving of cloth, became the explosive spark that ignited the wider revolution. For centuries, these processes had been the backbone of the cottage industry, performed slowly and painstakingly by hand. The spinning wheel, operated almost exclusively by women known as spinsters, could only produce a single thread at a time. The loom, manned by a skilled male weaver, then turned that thread into cloth. This system created a perpetual bottleneck. Spinners simply could not produce enough yarn to keep the weavers constantly supplied. The entire economy of cloth was constrained by the slow, human pace of finger and foot. This bottleneck, however, created immense pressure and incentive for innovation. The result was a breathtaking sequence of inventions in the latter half of the 18th century that mechanized the entire process. It began with the flying shuttle, which sped up weaving. This, in turn, intensified the demand for yarn, leading to a series of revolutionary spinning machines. James Hargreaves' spinning jenny, circa 1764, allowed a single worker to spin 8, then 16, then eventually over 100 threads simultaneously. Richard Arkwright's water frame, circa 1769, a heavier and more powerful machine, produced a stronger thread and, critically, was too large to be operated in a home. It required a dedicated power source, first water wheels and later steam engines. Samuel Crompton's hybrid mule combined the principles of the jenny and the frame to produce a yarn that was both fine and strong, suitable for any type of cloth. These inventions did more than just increase the speed of production, they fundamentally altered its very nature. The new machinery was large, expensive, and power-hungry. It could not be housed in a rural cottage. This single fact spelled the end of the domestic system. The logical, and indeed necessary, step was to gather these machines in a single, centralized location, a factory, where a power source could drive them all simultaneously. The textile industry, therefore, did not just contribute to the Industrial Revolution, it created its very heart and prototype, the factory system. The relentless drive to produce more cloth, faster and cheaper, is what forced the invention of new technologies, new power sources, and a new, industrialized way of life, setting a pattern that would soon be replicated across every other industry. While the textile inventions provided the initial spark, it was the development of the steam engine that truly unleashed the Industrial Revolution's full, world-altering power. Prior to its perfection, industry was tethered to the geography of flowing water. Factories, no matter how large their machines, had to be built along riverbanks to harness the force of water wheels. This was a significant limitation. It placed industrial centers in often remote locations, and production could be halted by seasonal droughts or winter freezes. The search for a more reliable and powerful source of energy led engineers deep into Britain's coal mines, where the challenge was not powering machinery, but draining the floodwaters that constantly threatened to engulf the tunnels. It was in these wet, dark depths that the story of the steam engine begins. Early prototypes, like Thomas Newcomen's atmospheric engine in 1712, were crude and wildly inefficient, but they demonstrated a profound principle: the power of steam could be harnessed to perform mechanical work. However, the true breakthrough, the one that would make the steam engine the universal engine of industry, came from the mind of Scottish engineer James Watt. While repairing a model Newcomen engine, Watt recognized its critical flaw: the immense waste of energy as the cylinder was repeatedly heated and cooled. His revolutionary solution, a separate condenser, dramatically improved the engine's efficiency, power, and fuel economy. Later, with the help of businessman Matthew Boulton, Watt developed a method to transform the engine's reciprocating, back and forth, motion into rotary, round and round, motion. This final innovation was the master key that unlocked the modern world. A steam engine with rotary motion could now drive the machinery of any factory, textile mills, iron forges, flour mills, anywhere, at any time, and in any weather. The factory was liberated from the riverbank and could be built in burgeoning cities like Manchester and Birmingham, close to labor and markets. It provided the relentless, consistent power that the new machines demanded, turning them from novelties into truly transformative forces of production. The steam engine became more than just a machine, it was the beating heart of the new industrial age, pumping power and potential into every facet of the economy and setting the stage for the next great leap, the conquest of distance itself with the steam-powered locomotive and ship. The convergence of powerful machinery and the steam engine necessitated a revolutionary new way of organizing human labor and production, the factory system. This was not merely an architectural change from cottage to brick building, it was a profound social and economic revolution that fundamentally redefined the relationship between workers, their work, and time itself. The cottage industry, for all its inefficiencies, was decentralized and offered artisans a degree of autonomy over their pace and schedule. The factory, in stark contrast, centralized everything. It gathered vast numbers of workers, expensive machinery, and a powerful energy source under a single roof, creating an ecosystem dedicated to one goal: maximizing output and efficiency on an unprecedented scale. This new system imposed a rigid, impersonal discipline that was alien to pre-industrial life. Work was no longer governed by the natural rhythms of the day or the task at hand, but by the relentless, monotonous rhythm of the machine and the strict dictates of the factory clock. The whistle replaced the sun as the arbiter of the day, summoning thousands to their posts for shifts that could last 12, 14, or even 16 hours. Inside, the factory was a world of noise, heat, and constant motion. Workers became attendants to the machinery, performing repetitive, specialized tasks in sync with the whirring belts and pounding engines. This division of labor, while incredibly efficient for mass production, reduced complex crafts to simple, mind-numbing operations, stripping the worker of any sense of artistry or ownership over the finished product. The factory became the dominant social institution of the industrial age, creating a new geography of power and a new class structure. It concentrated immense capital and control in the hands of the factory owners, while reducing the worker to a replaceable cog in a vast, impersonal machine. The system drew millions from the countryside into burgeoning industrial cities, creating a readily available labor force that was entirely dependent on wages for survival. This dependency gave owners immense power to set pay and conditions. The factory, therefore, was more than just a place of work. It was the engine of a new social order, one characterized by a stark divide between capital and labor, and it forged the very concept of an industrial working class, whose struggles and solidarity would shape the centuries to come. It was in these cavernous, noisy halls that the modern world of work, with all its productivity and its profound social challenges, was born. If the factory was the heart of the new industrial world and the steam engine its muscle, then coal and iron were its lifeblood and skeleton. These two raw materials formed the essential, symbiotic partnership upon which the entire revolution was built. Without them, the grand visions of inventors and industrialists would have remained mere drawings. With them, the physical landscape of the planet was reshaped. Their extraction and refinement became massive industries in their own right, driving technological innovation and creating a new, brutal geography of mines, forges, and industrial landscapes that symbolized the power and the price of progress. Coal was the indispensable fuel that fed the revolution's insatiable appetite for energy. It was the concentrated solar energy of ancient forests, unlocked to power the steam engines that ran the factories, pumped the mines, and later, propelled the locomotives and steamships. As demand skyrocketed, coal mining was transformed from a small-scale operation into a deep-pit industrial enterprise. Mines plunged hundreds of feet into the earth, creating a subterranean world of immense danger and hardship for the men, women, and children who worked there. The quest for coal dictated the location of new industrial centers, with cities like Manchester and Sheffield rising to prominence precisely because they sat atop or near rich coal fields. The black smoke billowing from factory chimneys became the visible symbol of this new age, a testament to the power of King Coal. Iron, in parallel, was the material of construction. It provided the physical framework for the new world. The early, brittle form of cast iron was soon superseded by the stronger, more versatile wrought iron and, later, by the mass production of steel through the Bessemer process. This progression in metallurgy was critical. It was iron that built the massive frames of the textile machines, the cylinders of the steam engines, the rails and locomotives of the railways, and the girders for the great bridges and viaducts that now spanned rivers and valleys. The iron industry itself was a spectacle of raw power, centered around the blast furnace, a towering structure that burned day and night, transforming ore into molten metal amidst intense heat and roaring flames. Together, coal and iron created a powerful feedback loop. Better steam engines powered by coal allowed for more efficient mining of both coal and iron ore, and better iron was used to build stronger, more powerful steam engines. This synergistic relationship was the material foundation upon which the modern, industrial world was literally forged. The transformative power of steam and iron reached its most spectacular and visible expression with the advent of the railway. This was the revolution in motion, a force that did not just accelerate production within a factory, but accelerated life itself, collapsing distance and redefining humanity's relationship with time and space. While canals and improved roads had begun this process, the railway represented a quantum leap. It was a system of unparalleled efficiency and speed, a network of iron rails that could carry massive loads of goods and vast numbers of people across continents, regardless of weather, day or night. The railway did not just connect places, it integrated regional economies into a cohesive national market and forged the very concept of a standardized time. The iconic symbol of this new age was the steam locomotive, a mobile steam engine on wheels that embodied raw power and progress. Its development, culminating in George Stephenson's rocket in 1829, demonstrated that the principles of the factory could be set in motion. The sight of a locomotive, belching smoke and steam as it thundered across the countryside at previously unimaginable speeds of 30 miles per hour or more, was both terrifying and exhilarating to contemporaries. It was a tangible, visceral manifestation of the new industrial power. The railway mania that followed saw a frantic burst of investment and construction, etching a web of tracks across Britain and soon, the world. The social and economic consequences were profound. Perishable goods like milk and fish could be transported from rural areas to burgeoning urban centers, improving diets and creating national markets for food. Heavy industrial materials, coal, iron, and machinery, could be moved quickly and cheaply, fueling further industrial growth. People gained a new mobility. For the first time, it became feasible for ordinary individuals to travel beyond their immediate locality, leading to the growth of seaside resorts and the beginnings of modern tourism. The railway demanded logistical precision, which in turn led to the adoption of standardized time zones to replace the patchwork of local sun times. In essence, the railway shrank the world, creating a smaller, more interconnected, and faster-paced planet. It was the ultimate proof of the Industrial Revolution's power not only to create new things but to fundamentally reshape the human experience of geography and time, binding the nation together with bands of iron. The rise of the factory and the spread of the railway triggered one of the most dramatic and irreversible social transformations in human history, the mass migration from the countryside to the city. This was the Great Urban Explosion, a demographic earthquake that reshaped the very map of human settlement. For millennia, the vast majority of people had lived in rural communities. Within a few short decades, the balance tipped irreversibly towards urban centers. This was not a gentle shift, but a violent and chaotic rupture, as millions were pulled by the promise of work in the new factories or pushed off the land by enclosures and changes in agricultural practice. The result was the meteoric rise of the industrial city, a new and often terrifying form of human environment. Cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and Glasgow became the shock cities of the age, their growth rate staggering and unprecedented. Manchester, for instance, the world's first industrial city, saw its population explode from a modest town of around 25,000 in 1770 to a teeming metropolis of over 300,000 by 1850. This hypergrowth far outstripped any capacity for planning or infrastructure development. The demand for housing was so intense and immediate that the landscape was hastily covered with row upon row of back-to-back terraced houses, built as cheaply and quickly as possible by speculative landlords. These homes were crammed tightly around the factories, ensuring workers lived within walking distance of their grueling shifts, but also ensuring they were constantly enveloped in the soot, smoke, and noise of industry. This rapid, unplanned urbanization created a landscape of stark contrasts and profound hardship. The charming, if sometimes squalid, disorder of pre-industrial towns was replaced by the grim, geometric uniformity of the industrial slum. There was no time for the organic development of communities, sanitation, water supplies, or public spaces. The sheer speed and scale of this migration overwhelmed everything in its path. The city was no longer primarily a center of commerce, government, or culture. It was now, first and foremost, a machine for housing labor. This immense concentration of humanity in such impoverished and unsanitary conditions created a volatile new social world, one that would soon force a reckoning with the human cost of industrial progress and give birth to the modern urban planning and public health movements. The city had become the dominant stage for modern life, but for the first generation of industrial workers, it was a stage set for a tragedy. The glittering promise of wages and work in the industrial city concealed a grim and often horrifying reality for the millions who crowded into its hastily built confines. Life for the new urban working class was a relentless struggle against squalor, disease, and environmental degradation on a scale never before witnessed. The very infrastructure of the city, overwhelmed by its own explosive growth, became a primary agent of suffering. There were no comprehensive sewage systems or clean water supplies for these vast new populations. Waste from thousands of homes, along with effluent from factories, was typically dumped into open gutters or cesspools that frequently overflowed, contaminating the groundwater and local rivers, which were also the main source of drinking water. The result was a public health catastrophe. The most devastating consequence of this filth was the rampant spread of disease. Cholera, a waterborne bacterium, became the terrifying scourge of the industrial city, striking with terrifying speed and lethality. Epidemics would sweep through the overcrowded slums, killing thousands, with doctors powerless to stop it. Typhus and typhoid fever, also born from unsanitary conditions, were endemic. Tuberculosis, the White Plague, thrived in the damp, cramped, and poorly ventilated lodgings, claiming lives slowly and relentlessly. For the first time in history, urban death rates often exceeded birth rates, with the population of cities being maintained only by constant inward migration from the countryside. The city, the supposed beacon of progress, was literally a killer. Beyond disease, the sheer physical environment was one of unremitting grimness. The air was thick with coal smoke and soot from countless domestic hearths and factory chimneys, blackening buildings and lungs alike. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the perpetual industrial haze. The narrow, unpaved streets were often rivers of mud and refuse, devoid of greenery or public space for recreation. Entire families were frequently crammed into single, damp rooms in cellars or attics, with no privacy and little comfort. This was the dark underbelly of industrial progress, a world of profound environmental pollution and human misery that stood in stark contrast to the wealth being generated. The industrial city, for all its dynamism, created a new kind of poverty, urban, concentrated, and brutally oppressive, forcing society to confront the horrifying human cost of its newfound material wealth. Out of the chaotic and crowded slums of the industrial cities emerged a new and defining social force, the industrial working class, or proletariat. This was not the skilled artisan or the independent farmer of the old world, but a new kind of laborer, whose existence was entirely redefined by the factory system and the wage economy. Their lives were no longer governed by the seasonal rhythms of nature or the flexible pace of cottage industry, but by the rigid, impersonal discipline of the factory clock and the relentless pace of the machine. This new class was forged in the crucible of industrial labor, and their collective experience created a shared identity defined by hardship, interdependence, and a common relationship to the means of production. The worker's day was long, monotonous, and grueling. Shifts of 12 to 16 hours were common, 6 days a week, with few breaks. The work itself was often mind-numbingly repetitive, consisting of tending to a single machine, performing one small, specialized task over and over again. This stood in stark contrast to the varied and skilled work of a pre-industrial craftsman who would see a product through from start to finish. In the factory, the worker was an appendage of the machine, valued not for their skill or judgment, but for their endurance and obedience. The noise was deafening, the air was thick with lint or dust, and the environment was fraught with danger, as unguarded machinery could easily maim or kill the careless or exhausted. This new way of life created a profound dependency. Unlike the peasant who might have owned a small plot of land or the artisan who owned their tools, the factory worker owned nothing but their own labor power. Their survival was entirely contingent on earning a daily or weekly wage. This dependency placed them in a position of extreme vulnerability against the factory owner, who could dictate terms, cut pay, or dismiss workers at will. There was no job security, no sick pay, and no pension. This fundamental power imbalance, and the shared experience of exploitation and hardship within the factory walls, began to forge a powerful sense of solidarity among workers. They lived in the same slums, worked the same long hours, and faced the same struggles, laying the groundwork for the class consciousness and collective action that would soon express itself in the form of trade unions and social movements, forever changing the political landscape of the modern world. The relentless engine of the factory system was fueled not only by the labor of adult men but, crucially and tragically, by the widespread and systematic employment of women and children. Their exploitation represented the deepest and most poignant human cost of the Industrial Revolution, revealing a system that prioritized profit over the most basic forms of welfare and family structure. In the pre-industrial economy, women and children had worked within the context of the household or farm, their labor integrated into family survival. The factory tore this apart, pulling them out of the home and into the public, often brutal, world of industrial production, where they became a cheap, disposable, and easily managed labor force. Children were particularly sought after for specific tasks. Their small size and nimble fingers made them ideal for jobs adults could not easily perform, such as crawling under active machinery to clear jams or piecing broken threads in the humid, cramped conditions of textile mills. They were employed as trappers in coal mines, sitting alone in the dark for up to 12 hours a day to open and close ventilation doors. Orphans from workhouses were often apprenticed to mill owners, becoming virtual slaves, housed in barracks and worked to the bone. The work was not only mentally stultifying but physically devastating. Long hours spent in fixed positions led to deformities, and the dangerous, unguarded machinery caused countless injuries. The loss of education and a normal childhood created a generation robbed of its future, their health and potential sacrificed for industrial output. Women, meanwhile, were drawn into the factories in massive numbers, primarily in textiles, as they were paid significantly less than men for the same work. This provided them with a new, albeit meager, form of economic independence, but it came at an immense social and personal cost. The double burden of working an exhausting shift and then returning home to manage a household and children in squalid conditions was crushing. The traditional family economy was shattered, with all members working different, long hours. Domestic life became fragmented and strained. The presence of women and children in the factories also had the effect of depressing overall wage levels, making it nearly impossible for a single male breadwinner to support a family. This systemic exploitation of the most vulnerable was not an accidental byproduct but a foundational element of early industrial capitalism, creating a social crisis so severe that it would eventually provoke public outrage and lead to the first, hesitant steps of government regulation and labor reform. While the industrial working class endured the grime and hardship of the factory floor, a powerful new social force was ascending, the industrial middle class, often referred to as the bourgeoisie. This group became the undeniable beneficiaries of the new economic order, their wealth and influence growing in direct proportion to the expansion of industry. This was not the old, land-based aristocracy, but a new class whose status was derived from capital, enterprise, and professional skill. They were the factory owners, the bankers, the engineers, the merchants, and the managers, the architects and operators of the industrial machine. Their rise marked a fundamental shift in the social order, challenging the centuries-old dominance of the landed gentry and creating a new center of economic and, eventually, political power. The lives of the middle class stood in stark contrast to those of the workers they employed. They resided in spacious, well-furnished homes built in newly developed suburbs, deliberately separated from the pollution and squalor of the industrial city. Their domestic life was organized around the new ideal of separate spheres, where the husband ventured out to the public world of business and industry, and the wife managed the private, domestic sphere, a symbol of the family's refinement and moral virtue. This lifestyle was supported by a growing array of consumer goods, mass-produced furniture, carpets, china, and clothing, that became markers of their social standing. They valued education, self-improvement, and respectability, cultivating a culture that celebrated hard work, thrift, and moral rectitude. Politically, this class was increasingly assertive. They championed the economic principles of laissez-faire capitalism, opposing government interference in business and the protectionist corn laws that kept food prices high for their workers' benefit. Their wealth gave them a powerful voice, and through relentless political agitation, such as the Chartist movement, they gradually extended voting rights and political representation to themselves, eroding the monopoly of the aristocracy. The middle class became the great evangelists of the industrial age, celebrating progress, innovation, and individual ambition. They saw their success as a product of their own merit and effort, a stark contrast to the inherited privilege of the old elite. In doing so, they established the core values of the modern capitalist society, creating a social and cultural model of aspiration and material comfort that would define the ambitions of the centuries to come. The seismic economic shifts of the Industrial Revolution did more than just transform production, they fundamentally reshaped the way society understood wealth, labor, and the very organization of economic life. The old, state-controlled mercantilist system, with its focus on bullion and protected trade, was swept away by the rising tide of industrial capitalism. This new system, characterized by private ownership of the means of production, free market competition, and the profit motive, demanded a new intellectual framework. In response, a series of powerful economic and social theories emerged, offering competing visions for society that would dominate political thought for the next 2 centuries and beyond. The most influential defense of this new order came from Adam Smith, whose 1776 work, The Wealth of Nations, became the Bible of industrial capitalism. Smith argued that collective prosperity was best achieved not through state regulation, but through individual self-interest operating in a competitive marketplace. His concept of the invisible hand suggested that by pursuing their own profit, individuals inadvertently benefit society as a whole by providing goods, services, and employment. Smith championed laissez-faire economics, the idea that governments should minimize interference in the economy, allowing capital, labor, and goods to flow freely. This philosophy provided the intellectual justification for the actions of the new industrialists, who resisted factory reforms and workers' rights as unnatural constraints on the market. However, the stark realities of industrial life, the poverty, exploitation, and cyclical boom and bust crises, spawned a powerful critique. The most formidable of these critics was Karl Marx. Working in the mid-19th century with Friedrich Engels, Marx analyzed industrial capitalism not as a system of freedom, but as one of inherent class conflict. He argued that the capitalist class, or bourgeoisie, exploited the working class, or proletariat, by paying them less than the value their labor created, pocketing the difference as profit. Marx predicted that this exploitation would inevitably lead to rising class consciousness and a proletarian revolution, overthrowing capitalism and establishing a classless, communist society. While Smith saw capitalism as the end of history's economic journey, Marx saw it as a violent, necessary stage on the path to a more equitable future. This intellectual clash between the defense of capitalism and the revolutionary call for its abolition framed the great ideological battles of the 20th century, demonstrating that the Industrial Revolution was not merely a technological event, but a profound battleground of ideas. The furnace of the Industrial Revolution, burning brightly in Europe and North America, required a constant and ever-increasing supply of fuel, and its finished goods demanded ever larger markets. These twin needs, for raw materials and new consumers, projected the revolution's power outward, transforming it from a regional event into a global force that reshaped the world map and the fate of nations. This economic imperative became the primary driver of the New Imperialism, a period of frantic and aggressive colonial expansion in the late 19th century. Industrialized nations, armed with superior technology and a firm belief in their racial and cultural superiority, embarked on a competitive scramble to bring vast territories in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific under their direct political and economic control. The dynamics of this new imperialism were distinctly industrial. Colonies were no longer just sources of precious metals or hubs for the slave trade, they were now essential cogs in the industrial machine. Regions like the Indian subcontinent were forced to supply raw cotton for Lancashire's mills, while the Congo was exploited for its rubber and the Malay Peninsula for its tin. These resources were extracted at minimal cost, often through brutal systems of forced labor, and shipped to the factories of the West. Once processed into finished goods, textiles, tools, and other manufactured products, these same colonies were then forced to become markets for them. Local industries were deliberately suppressed. For example, India's once thriving handloom textile industry was systematically dismantled by British policy to create a captive market for British cloth. This process created a deeply unequal global economic system, often described as the corporifery model. The industrial, core nations of Europe and North America specialized in manufacturing, wielding financial and political power. The colonized periphery was relegated to the role of supplying raw materials and consuming finished goods, a relationship that stifled their own industrial development and locked them into a cycle of economic dependency. This division of labor, enforced by gunboats and colonial administration, laid the foundation for the vast global wealth and development disparities that persist to this day. The Industrial Revolution, therefore, was not merely a European phenomenon, it was the engine that powered a new, interconnected, and profoundly unequal world order, whose geopolitical and economic legacies continue to shape international relations in the 21st century. Just as the initial wave of industrialization began to mature, a new and even more transformative surge of innovation emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a period often termed the Second Industrial Revolution. If the first revolution was defined by steam, textiles, and iron, the second was characterized by a new suite of technologies: steel, electricity, the internal combustion engine, and advanced chemicals, that pushed technological progress into hyperdrive and fundamentally reshaped the modern world. This phase was less about the initial breakthrough of machine production and more about the refinement, intensification, and application of science to industry on a mass scale, creating the technological bedrock of the 20th century. The development of new methods for mass-producing steel, most notably the Bessemer process, was a cornerstone of this era. Steel, being stronger, more durable, and more versatile than iron, became the essential material for the next generation of ambition. It allowed for the construction of skyscrapers that could redefine city skylines, longer bridges that could span wider rivers, and more powerful railways and ships that could connect continents with greater efficiency. Simultaneously, the mastery of electricity began to transform both industry and daily life. Factories could now be lit and powered by electric motors, which were cleaner, more flexible, and safer than the labyrinth of steam engines and drive shafts. The invention of the incandescent light bulb extended the productive day and illuminated city streets, while the telegraph and telephone began to annihilate distance in communication. This period also saw the rise of the internal combustion engine, which would eventually liberate transportation from the fixed tracks of the railway and unleash the age of the automobile and the airplane. In the laboratory, the new chemical industry created a wave of synthetic materials, from fertilizers that boosted agricultural yields to explosives for construction and warfare, and eventually, the first plastics. The second industrial revolution was thus marked by a deeper integration of science and industry, with corporate laboratories and systematic research driving innovation. It was an era that saw the birth of the modern corporation, mass consumer culture, and a world increasingly dependent on fossil fuels and complex technology, setting the stage for the unprecedented growth, conflicts, and global interconnectedness of the contemporary era. While the railways and steamships were conquering physical distance, a parallel and equally profound revolution was underway in the realm of information. The ability to communicate instantly across vast distances fundamentally altered the dynamics of commerce, governance, and daily life, effectively shrinking the world in a way that was even more immediate than transportation. This revolution began with the electric telegraph, a technology that, for the first time in human history, decoupled communication from the speed of a physical object, be it a horse, a train, or a ship. Messages that once took days or weeks to deliver could now be transmitted in a matter of minutes, creating a nervous system for the burgeoning global economy. The impact of the telegraph was transformative. For businesses, it allowed for the rapid coordination of complex supply chains, the instantaneous transmission of commodity prices between distant markets, and the birth of modern financial trading. News, which was once stale by the time it arrived, could now be reported almost as it happened, fostering a new sense of global awareness and immediacy. Governments could administer their empires and armies with unprecedented speed and coordination. The laying of transatlantic telegraph cables in the 1860s truly created a wired world, linking Europe and the Americas in a continuous conversation and making global events a matter of shared, real-time knowledge. The communication revolution did not stop with the telegraph. It was soon superseded and deepened by the invention of the telephone, which added the nuance and intimacy of the human voice to instant communication. This transformed business operations and began to reshape social interactions. Later, the development of wireless telegraphy, or radio, by figures like Guglielmo Marconi, severed the final physical tether, the wire itself, allowing for communication with ships at sea and across vast, unconnected territories. This progression from telegraph to telephone to radio represented more than just technological upgrades. It was a fundamental rewiring of human consciousness. It created an expectation of instant access to information and to other people, fostering a new kind of interconnectedness that laid the essential groundwork for the global information network we inhabit today. The ability to know what was happening anywhere, almost as it happened, created the modern sense of a shared global present. The unprecedented productive power of the Industrial Revolution did more than just fill factory warehouses. It began to fundamentally reshape the relationship between ordinary people and material goods, planting the seeds of the modern consumer culture. For the vast majority of pre-industrial society, life was characterized by subsistence and scarcity. Most people owned very few possessions, which were typically handmade, durable, and often inherited. The concept of shopping for non-essential items was a luxury reserved for a tiny elite. Mass production shattered this ancient reality by dramatically lowering the cost of a vast array of goods, from clothing and tableware to clocks and furniture, making them accessible to the burgeoning middle class and, gradually, even to segments of the working class. This flood of affordable goods necessitated new methods of marketing and distribution. The department store emerged as a palace of consumption, a dazzling new urban space where a wide variety of mass-produced goods were displayed under one roof. These stores, with their fixed prices and persuasive window displays, transformed shopping from a simple transaction into a leisure activity and a form of social expression. Simultaneously, the rise of mail-order catalogs, such as Sears, Roebuck and Company in the United States, brought this new world of goods directly to rural households, further homogenizing tastes and styles across a nation. To stimulate demand for this ever-increasing output, the modern advertising industry was born. Early advertisements moved beyond simply informing the public about a product's availability and began to craft narratives, associating goods with ideals of social status, domestic bliss, and personal success. This marked a profound psychological shift. Identity became less tied to one's trade or birth and increasingly expressed through patterns of consumption: the clothes one wore, the furnishings in one's home, the products one purchased. For the first time, ordinary people could participate in a form of material social climbing and self-definition through their buying choices. This cycle of production, marketing, and consumption created a new economic engine, a society that not only produced en masse but was also conditioned to consume en masse. The seeds sown in the 19th century, the desire for novelty, the association of goods with identity, and the relentless stimulation of new wants, would grow into the dominant consumer culture of the 20th and 21st centuries, making the Industrial Revolution the birthplace not only of how we work, but also of how we shop and see ourselves through the things we own. The march of industrial progress was not met with universal acclaim, it was also met with the desperate resistance of those whose livelihoods it destroyed. The most iconic manifestation of this early rebellion was the Luddite movement, which emerged in the English Midlands and North between 1811 and 1816. Far from being technophobes who blindly hated all machinery, as the term is often misused today, the original Luddites were highly skilled textile workers, framework knitters and weavers, protesting the specific introduction of new machinery that was being used to undermine their craft and their wages. Their rebellion was not against technology in the abstract, but against the unfair and exploitative practices it enabled. The central issue was the use of unskilled labor to operate new, wide-frame knitting machines and power looms, which produced inferior quality cloth and stockings at a fraction of the cost. Factory owners used this technology to bypass the skilled artisans, driving down wages and violating established labor practices. In response, organized groups of workers, often operating under the cover of darkness and using the mythical figure of General Ned Ludd as their symbolic leader, would launch raids on factories to smash the specific machines they saw as threats to their trade. These attacks were not random acts of violence but targeted, disciplined acts of industrial sabotage, intended to intimidate owners into abandoning their cost-cutting practices. The Luddite movement was, in essence, a form of collective bargaining by other means. At a time when trade unions were illegal and workers had no legal recourse to negotiate wages or conditions, machine breaking was one of the few powerful tools at their disposal. It was a desperate attempt to preserve a way of life and a standard of living that was being rapidly erased by industrial capitalism. The British government responded with brutal force, making the frame breaking a capital crime and deploying thousands of troops to the affected regions. The movement was ultimately crushed after several Luddites were executed or transported to penal colonies. However, the Luddites left a powerful legacy. They represented the first major, organized resistance to the industrial system, highlighting the profound human dislocation that accompanied technological change and raising enduring questions about who benefits from progress and who is left behind, questions that remain intensely relevant in our own era of automation and artificial intelligence. In the face of brutal working conditions, long hours, and poverty wages, the industrial working class gradually shifted from spontaneous, localized protests like the Luddite uprisings to a more sustained and organized form of resistance, the labor movement. The realization that individual workers were powerless against the factory owner led to the understanding that collective action was their only source of strength. Out of the shared misery of the factory floor and the crowded slum, a powerful sense of solidarity, or class consciousness, was forged. Workers began to form mutual aid societies and, more importantly, trade unions, organizations dedicated to representing the collective interests of laborers through negotiation and, when necessary, confrontation. The early path to unionization was extraordinarily difficult. For much of the early 19th century, trade unions were illegal under laws like the British Combination Acts, which viewed them as conspiracies against trade. Early organizers faced blacklisting, violence, and imprisonment. Despite this, the movement persisted underground and, after the repeal of the Combination Acts in 1824, began to operate more openly. The primary tools of the unions were collective bargaining and the strike. By collectively refusing to work, workers could halt production and impose a financial cost on the employer, forcing them to negotiate over wages, hours, and conditions. These early strikes were often bitter, protracted affairs, frequently met with strikebreakers and state-backed violence, but they also scored crucial victories that demonstrated the power of unified action. The labor movement evolved from small, craft-specific unions to larger, more inclusive federations that could represent workers across entire industries. This growing organization also found expression in political activism, most notably in the Chartist movement of the 1830s and 40s in Britain, which demanded universal male suffrage and other political reforms to give the working class a voice in Parliament. The rise of labor movements was a watershed moment in modern history. It represented the birth of a countervailing power to industrial capital, fundamentally altering the relationship between employer and employee. The relentless pressure from unions, decade after decade, was the primary force behind the gradual improvement of working conditions, the establishment of the weekend, the concept of a living wage, and the creation of the social safety net. It was a long and bloody struggle, but it successfully channeled the desperation of the working class into a powerful force that would shape the social contract of the modern world. The horrific conditions in factories and mines, exposed by reformers, journalists, and the growing clamor of the labor movement, eventually created a moral and political crisis that the government could no longer ignore. The prevailing laissez-faire ideology, which argued for non-interference in the economy, began to crumble in the face of overwhelming evidence of systematic exploitation, particularly of children and women. This marked a pivotal turning point, the beginning of state intervention to mitigate the worst excesses of industrial capitalism and to establish a baseline of humane treatment for workers. The first, hesitant steps in this direction were a series of factory acts passed in Britain throughout the 19th century, which created a new precedent for government responsibility in social welfare. The initial focus was on the most vulnerable. The Health and Morals of Apprentices Act of 1802, though weakly enforced, was the first of its kind, aiming to improve conditions for pauper children in textile mills. More significant was the Factory Act of 1833, which, despite its limitations, established a crucial principle: independent oversight. It appointed the first government factory inspectors who had the power to enter workplaces and enforce the law. This act specifically prohibited the employment of children under 9 in textile mills and limited the hours of those aged 9 to 13 to 48 hours per week. Subsequent acts, like the 1844 and 1847 Factory Acts, further reduced working hours for women and children and introduced safety requirements for machinery. These early laws were fiercely opposed by many industrialists, who argued they would destroy profitability and represented an unacceptable intrusion into private enterprise. The laws were also limited in scope, often applying only to the textile industry at first. However, their symbolic and practical impact was immense. They established that the unchecked power of factory owners had limits and that society, through its government, had a stake in the health and well-being of its workforce. They acknowledged that children should be in school, not in mines, and that all workers deserved some protection from the most egregious dangers and exploitations. This legislative momentum, once started, proved irreversible. It paved the way for more comprehensive labor regulations, including minimum wage laws, accident insurance, and old age pensions, laying the foundational stones of the modern welfare state and redefining the role of government from a passive observer to an active guardian of public welfare in an industrial age. While the Industrial Revolution is rightly measured by its social and economic upheavals, its most enduring and planetary legacy may be its environmental impact. For the first time in history, human activity began to alter the fundamental chemistry of the air, water, and land on a massive scale, marking the dawn of the Anthropocene, the geological epoch defined by human influence. The revolution was powered by coal, and the burning of this fossil fuel on an industrial scale unleashed a new phenomenon, pervasive, human-made pollution that transformed local environments and began a process of global change whose consequences we are still grappling with today. The most visible and immediate impact was on the air. The skies over industrial cities like Manchester and London were perpetually stained with a thick, sulfurous smog, a toxic cocktail of coal smoke and industrial fumes. This pea soup fog blackened buildings, poisoned lungs, and led to a dramatic increase in respiratory diseases like bronchitis and asthma. The very climate of cities was altered, as the soot and particulates in the air reduced sunlight and created unnatural microclimates. Rivers, the lifeblood of pre-industrial communities, were transformed into open sewers. Factories discharged untreated chemical waste, dyes, and heavy metals directly into waterways, while human waste from overcrowded cities contaminated water supplies. Rivers like the Thames in London became biologically dead, notorious for their stench and their role in spreading waterborne diseases like cholera. Beyond pollution, the revolution reshaped the physical landscape itself. The demand for coal and minerals led to a massive expansion of mining, scarring the countryside with pit heads, slag heaps, and quarries. Vast tracts of forest were cleared to provide timber for mine shafts, construction, and fuel, leading to deforestation and soil erosion. This large-scale extraction of resources established a take-make-dispose model that treated the natural world as an infinite source of raw materials and an infinite sink for waste. The Industrial Revolution, therefore, established the fundamental environmental paradigm of the modern world, one of unprecedented energy use, resource consumption, and pollution. It initiated the great acceleration in carbon dioxide emissions that drives modern climate change. In harnessing the power of ancient sunlight locked in coal, humanity unlocked not only immense productive power but also began an uncontrolled experiment with the planet's ecosystems, creating an environmental debt that future generations would be forced to pay. The Industrial Revolution was more than an economic event. It was a psychological and intellectual watershed that fundamentally altered humanity's perception of its own power and potential. The breathtaking pace of technological change, from the steam engine to the railway to the telegraph, fostered a widespread and powerful belief in the idea of progress. For the first time, it seemed that human society was not cyclical or static, but was on an inexorable, upward trajectory, constantly improving through science, reason, and innovation. This new worldview replaced a sense of fate with a sense of agency, suggesting that poverty, disease, and distance were not immutable facts of life but solvable engineering problems. This spirit of optimism and human ingenuity found its most spectacular expression in events like London's Great Exhibition of 1851. Housed in the revolutionary Crystal Palace, a vast structure of glass and iron that was itself a testament to industrial prowess, the exhibition was a dazzling showcase of global industry and invention. It was a World's Fair designed to celebrate manufacturing, commerce, and the peaceful triumph of human reason. For the millions who visited, it was a physical manifestation of the new, modern age, a temple to progress where the latest machines, from powerful locomotives to intricate looms, were displayed like religious relics. It promoted a sense of wonder and pride in technological achievement and reinforced the notion that industry was a civilizing force destined to improve all of humankind. Scientifically, the demands of industry drove advances in fields like chemistry, physics, and geology. The need to understand materials, energy, and efficiency pushed scientific inquiry in more practical, applied directions. Culturally, the revolution influenced everything from art to literature. The Romantic movement, for instance, arose in part as a reaction against the perceived soullessness of industrialism, celebrating instead the power and beauty of untamed nature. Meanwhile, realist novelists like Charles Dickens and Elizabeth Gaskell turned their attention to the social conditions of the industrial city, using their work to critique the human cost of progress and spark social conscience. The Industrial Revolution, therefore, did not just change what humanity could do, it changed how humanity thought about itself, its future, and its relationship with the natural world, setting the stage for the ideological battles and technological optimism that would define the centuries to come. The relentless engine of industrialization did not create a uniformly developed world. Instead, it forged a new and deeply hierarchical global order, creating a stark and enduring divide between the developed and the developing nations. This was not an accidental outcome but a direct consequence of the economic dynamics of the Industrial Revolution. The nations that industrialized first, primarily in Western Europe and North America, accumulated immense economic, military, and political power, which they used to structure the global economy to their overwhelming advantage. The rest of the world was largely relegated to the periphery, forced into a role that served the needs of the industrial core, a relationship that locked in patterns of dependency and underdevelopment that persist to this day. This division was formalized through the core periphery model of the world economy. The industrial core specialized in manufacturing high-value finished goods, controlling finance, technology, and global trade networks. The non-industrialized periphery, including vast regions of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, was compelled to specialize in the production and export of a narrow range of raw materials: cotton, rubber, tea, jute, minerals, and other primary commodities. This was not a relationship of equal partners. Colonial powers and economic pressure often deliberately deindustrialized rival economies. Britain's policies in India, for instance, dismantled its prosperous textile industry to create a captive market for British cloth. The terms of trade were systematically skewed. The price of manufactured goods rose relative to the price of raw materials, ensuring that wealth consistently flowed from the periphery to the core. This created a self-reinforcing cycle of inequality. The industrial core used its profits to invest in further technological innovation, education, and infrastructure, accelerating its own development. The periphery, lacking capital and control over its own economic destiny, remained dependent on exporting volatile commodity markets and importing expensive manufactured goods, stifling its own industrial potential. This global division of labor, established in the 19th century, laid the foundation for the vast wealth disparities we see in the modern world. It created a template where a small group of nations set the rules of the global economy, while a much larger group found their development paths constrained by a system they did not design. The Industrial Revolution, therefore, was not merely a European event, it was the genesis of the modern global inequality, creating a world economically and politically divided between the powerful few and the dependent many. The logic of the Industrial Revolution, which began with mechanizing individual tasks, reached its ultimate expression in the early 20th century with the perfection of the moving assembly line. This innovation represented the final step in the subordination of human labor to the relentless efficiency of the machine system. Pioneered by Henry Ford in his Highland Park factory for the production of the Model T automobile, the assembly line did not just speed up work, it fundamentally re-engineered the very process of production itself. It shifted the paradigm from workers moving to a stationary product to the product moving at a controlled, unvarying pace to the workers. This seemingly simple reversal unleashed staggering gains in productivity and brought the full force of industrial capitalism to the consumer society. The principle was one of extreme specialization and flow. Instead of a team of skilled workers assembling an entire car, the process was broken down into hundreds of small, simple, and repetitive tasks. Each worker, stationed at a fixed point along a continuously moving conveyor belt, performed only one or two of these tasks, over and over again. The chassis of the car moved down the line, and as it passed each station, it accumulated its parts until it rolled off as a finished product. This system drastically reduced the time required to build a complex object. The assembly time for a Model T plummeted from over 12 hours to just 93 minutes. The consequence was a dramatic reduction in cost, making what was once a luxury item accessible to the average American worker. Ford understood that his workers were also his potential customers. To this end, he famously introduced the $5 day, a wage that was substantially higher than the industry standard. This was not mere philanthropy, it was a strategic move to reduce high employee turnover caused by the mind-numbing monotony of the work and to empower his workers to buy the very cars they were building. This created a virtuous cycle of high wages and mass consumption that became a hallmark of 20th century capitalism. The assembly line, therefore, perfected mass production, cemented the age of consumer durables, and created a new template for modern industry. It became the dominant model for manufacturing everything from household appliances to electronics, profoundly shaping the modern world of work, commerce, and material culture, while also raising enduring questions about the dehumanizing effects of extreme task specialization. The technological and economic principles forged in the crucible of the Industrial Revolution did not end with the age of steam and steel. They found a powerful and transformative echo in the late 20th and 21st centuries with the dawn of the digital revolution. The parallels are striking and profound. Just as the Industrial Revolution used new technologies to amplify physical productivity, the digital revolution uses computers and networks to amplify mental and informational productivity. If the steam engine was the prime mover of the first revolution, the microprocessor is the prime mover of the second. Both eras are defined by a core invention that became a universal tool, reshaping every existing industry and spawning entirely new ones, from textile manufacturing to social media platforms. The fundamental logic of industrialization, standardization, specialization, and economies of scale is mirrored in the digital world. The factory system, which centralized production for efficiency, finds its parallel in the massive, centralized data centers that power our cloud computing. The assembly line, which broke complex tasks into simple, repetitive motions, is echoed in the algorithms and software that automate cognitive labor, from data entry to complex financial analysis. The railway and telegraph, which shrank geographic distance for goods and information, have been superseded by the internet and global fiber optic networks, which have created a truly instantaneous and interconnected global village. The transformation is just as disruptive. Just as artisans were displaced by machines, many traditional white-collar jobs are now being transformed or displaced by automation and artificial intelligence. Furthermore, the social and economic patterns repeat. The digital revolution has created immense new wealth and a new technological elite, reminiscent of the industrial bourgeoisie, while also generating concerns about wage stagnation and the precarious nature of work in the gig economy. It has created a new digital divide, mirroring the old corporifery dynamic, between those with access to technology and those without. The concentration of power in a handful of tech giants echoes the power of the great industrial trusts of the Gilded Age. In this sense, the digital revolution is not a departure from the Industrial Revolution, but its logical and direct continuation. We are still living in an age shaped by the imperative to harness technology for growth and efficiency, proving that the forces unleashed in the 18th century continue to be the defining currents of our modern world, now translated from mechanical bits and atoms into digital bits and bytes. To step out of our homes today is to walk through a world built by the Industrial Revolution. Its legacy is not confined to history books, it is the very bedrock of our modern existence, the invisible framework that supports every facet of our daily lives. The material abundance we often take for granted is its most immediate gift. The affordable clothing we wear, the mass-produced food we eat, the cars we drive, and the consumer electronics that fill our homes are all products of the mass production systems it pioneered. Our concept of a standard of living, with its expectation of continuous material improvement and access to a vast array of goods, was born not in antiquity, but in the furnaces and factories of the 18th and 19th centuries. The physical infrastructure of our societies is a direct inheritance from that era. The networks of roads and railways that connect our cities, the bridges that span our rivers, and the ports that handle global trade were largely constructed according to industrial principles and with industrial materials. The modern metropolis itself, with its towering skyscrapers of steel and glass, its complex public transit systems, and its concentration of economic activity, is the ultimate evolution of the industrial city. Even our fundamental relationship with time and work was forged in this period. The regimented structure of the 8-hour workday, the 5-day work week, and the very idea of clocking in are all cultural artifacts of the factory system's discipline, later reformed by the labor movements it sparked. Furthermore, the Industrial Revolution established the trajectory of modern science and technology. It cemented the partnership between scientific inquiry and practical application, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of innovation that continues to drive progress in medicine, engineering, and computing. It gave us the foundational energy systems, based on fossil fuels, that powered the 20th century and which we are now striving to replace. In essence, the world of the 21st century, with its global supply chains, its consumer culture, its urban landscapes, and its technological dynamism, is the mature and highly complex outcome of the industrial processes set in motion over 200 years ago. We are, in a very real sense, still living in the long shadow of the Industrial Revolution, inhabiting a world whose core operating system it designed. While the Industrial Revolution bestowed upon us the foundations of our material world, it also bequeathed a set of profound and unresolved challenges that continue to define the central crises of the 21st century. The paradigm of growth it established, predicated on the ever-accelerating extraction of resources and mass consumption, has collided with the finite reality of our planet. The most pressing of these legacies is the environmental crisis. The reliance on fossil fuels, initiated by coal and scaled up with oil and gas, ignited the process of anthropogenic climate change. The carbon dioxide released from 2 centuries of industrial activity now warms the atmosphere, threatening ecosystems, weather patterns, and global stability. Similarly, the pollution of air, water, and soil that began with the first factory towns has evolved into a planetary-scale problem of toxic waste, plastic contamination, and biodiversity loss. The economic model forged in the industrial age also created enduring structures of inequality. The vast wealth generated by industrialization was never equitably distributed, leading to the persistent divide between capital and labor, and between the global north and south. The same system that produced unprecedented aggregate wealth also produced deep-seated poverty and a concentration of resources in the hands of a minority. Today, this manifests in debates over fair wages, executive compensation, tax havens, and the yawning gap between the world's richest and poorest nations, a direct consequence of the corporatory dynamic established during the colonial era of industrialization. Furthermore, the revolution left us with unresolved questions about the human relationship with technology. The dehumanizing aspects of the factory system, where workers became cogs in a machine, find their modern parallel in concerns about automation and artificial intelligence displacing human labor and reducing complex skills to automated processes. The relentless pace of industrial life, which first alienated people from the natural rhythms of the land, has evolved into a culture of constant connectivity and burnout. The Industrial Revolution, therefore, did not merely solve old problems, it created new ones on a civilizational scale. It handed us the tools of immense power and prosperity, but without an instruction manual for managing their long-term social and environmental costs. Confronting these unresolved challenges, climate change, systemic inequality, and the ethical dimensions of technology, is the defining task of our time, and it requires reckoning directly with the complex legacy of the industrial age. As we reflect on the sweeping narrative of the Industrial Revolution, from the first spinning jenny to the sprawling digital networks of today, we must discard the notion that it was a finite historical event, confined to the pages of the 18th and 19th centuries. Instead, we must recognize it as the beginning of an ongoing, and ever-accelerating, process of transformation. The revolution was not a destination, but a point of departure, setting humanity on a new trajectory defined by perpetual technological change, economic restructuring, and social adaptation. The forces it unleashed, the coupling of science with industry, the imperative of growth, and the constant redefinition of work, did not cease with the advent of the assembly line or the electrical grid. They simply evolved, finding new forms in the digital and now the biological and AI-driven ages. The world we inhabit today is the direct and continuous output of that initial breakthrough. Our globalized economy, with its intricate supply chains, is the mature form of the trade networks forged by steamships and railways. Our digital lives, mediated by smartphones and the internet, are the logical extension of the telegraph's annihilation of distance. The very questions that torment our modern politics, the distribution of wealth, the rights of workers, the impact of automation on employment, and the role of regulation in a market economy, are all contemporary echoes of the debates that first erupted in the factory towns of Manchester and Birmingham. We are still grappling with the core problem of how to harness the immense productive power of technology for the broad benefit of humanity, rather than for a privileged few. Therefore, to study the Industrial Revolution is to do more than understand the past, it is to acquire a fundamental lens for interpreting the present and anticipating the future. It provides the origin story for our climate crisis, our urban landscapes, our consumer culture, and our technological anxieties. The transition we are currently undergoing, from a carbon-based industrial economy to a potentially sustainable digital one, is not the end of the industrial era, but its next, necessary phase. The revolution never ended, it merely changed its tools. By understanding its profound impacts, its triumphs, and its tragedies, we equip ourselves to navigate the complexities of our own time, to shape the next wave of change with wisdom, and to finally address the unresolved challenges that this relentless, world-building revolution has left at our feet.